If you're gearing up for an exam like the RBI Grade B, then you already know that getting a solid grip on inflation isn't just important, it's absolutely non negotiable. So, in this explainer, we're going to do a real deep dive into the key types of inflation, how we measure it, and all the critical nuances you need to have locked down to really nail those exam questions.
So, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with a super quick revision of the basics. Then we'll jump into the more complex, unusual states of inflation. After that, we'll unpack its structural causes, see how it's actually measured, and finally, we'll zoom in for a close-up on the Wholesale Price Index, or WPI. All right, first things first, before we get into all the complex stuff, we need to make sure our foundation is rock solid. So we're going to do a rapid-fire recap of the absolute essentials just to get everyone on the same page. Ready? Let's go. Okay, the definition. Look, the two words you absolutely have to remember here are general and sustained. We're not talking about the price of just one thing, like your favorite snack going up for a week. No, that's just a price spike. Inflation is a broad, ongoing rise in prices across the whole economy that, slowly eats away at the value of your money.
Next up, what causes it? Well, it usually boils down to two main culprits. On one side, you've got demand pull inflation. That's the classic textbook case of too much money chasing too few goods. You see this when everyone's out there spending, maybe because the economy's booming. Then, on the other side, you've got cost push inflation. This one comes from the supply side. Think of a sudden jump in oil prices that makes it more expensive to make and ship pretty much everything. Businesses have no choice but to pass those higher costs on to us. Okay, with the basics down, now we can really get into the good stuff. The more complicated and, honestly, more interesting states of inflation. These are the tricky scenarios that love to pop up in exams, so let's break them down.
First up, we've got the most extreme case you can imagine, hyperinflation. I mean, this is inflation on steroids. We're talking about prices just spiraling completely out of control, sometimes jumping by more than 50% in a single month. The classic modern example, of course, is Zimbabwe back in the late 2000s, where inflation got so bad that their currency became pretty much worthless. People literally had to resort to bartering or using foreign money. It's just a total economic collapse. And now for what is basically a policymaker's worst nightmare, stagflation. The name kind of gives it away, right? It's this awful, toxic mix of economic stagnation, which means the economy isn't growing and lots of people are unemployed, and high inflation. This is such a huge problem because the usual economic fixes just don't work. If you raise interest rates to fight the inflation, you make unemployment worse. But if you try to boost the economy to create jobs, you just pour more fuel on the inflation fire. It's the worst of both worlds. This is such a brilliant way to think about it. The economy, the car, is slowing down, maybe even stalling out. But the engine, which represents prices, is overheating like crazy. This whole situation completely broke the brains of economists back in the 1970s because it went against the prevailing theories. Stagflation proved, in the worst way possible, that you can have high inflation and high unemployment at the very same time. And this table just lays it all out, crystal clear. Normally, when you have inflation, you'd expect the economy to be growing and unemployment to be pretty low. But with stagflation, you get this absolutely brutal combination of high inflation, tons of unemployment, and an economy that's either not growing or even shrinking. Remembering that difference is really, really important. Okay, so we've talked about a problem. Now let's talk about a solution. Reflation. Now, this isn't something that just happens on its own. It's a deliberate policy choice. Think about what happens after a recession, when the economy is weak and prices might even be falling. That's when central banks and governments step in and actively try to stimulate things. They'll cut interest rates or boost spending to encourage people to buy again, gently nudging inflation back up to a healthier level. And this analogy just nails it. The economy is like a deflated balloon. Reflation is the policy of carefully, gently pumping air back into it. The whole goal is to get it back to its normal size, to get growth and prices back on track, without pumping so hard that you cause it to burst, which would be runaway inflation. It's a very, very delicate balancing act. Now let's shift gears a little bit. Let's look at situations where inflation isn't about the whole economy overheating, but about specific problems or imbalances within it. And this brings us to two really important ideas: skewflation and structural inflation. Have you ever had that feeling where you look at your grocery bill and it's gone through the roof, but at the same time, the price of a new phone or your data plan has actually gone down? Well, that's skewflation. It's inflation that's skewed or totally uneven. You get a massive price hike in one specific area, very often food, while everything else is kind of stable. And you can see how this would be a real puzzle for a central bank.
Okay, let's go even deeper now. Structural inflation is a really chronic problem, especially in developing economies. This isn't about a temporary spike in demand or too much money floating around. No, this is about the fundamental plumbing of the economy itself being broken or inefficient. The price rises keep happening because of these deep-rooted issues that just make it harder or more expensive to produce things.
So, what do these plumbing problems actually look like? Well, imagine farmers losing a chunk of their harvest because the roads are terrible and there's no cold storage. Or picture businesses that can't expand because of outdated regulations and just endless red tape. Every single one of these issues creates bottlenecks and adds costs that just keep pushing prices up year after year.
So, we've talked a ton about all these different types of inflation, but how do economists and policymakers actually put a number on it, right? How do they measure this stuff? Well, that's where inflation indexes come into the picture.
The best way to think about it is this. An inflation index is basically a thermometer for the economy. It gives us one single number that helps us understand how hot or cold prices are, and that lets us track how things are changing over time.
Building one of these thermometers is a pretty careful 5-step process. First, you pick a base year, which is just a normal year that you can use for comparison. Second, you create a representative basket of goods. Think of it as a typical shopping list for an average family. Third, and this part is so important, you give a weight to each item. So fuel gets a much bigger weight than, say, salt, because we spend a lot more of our budget on it. Fourth, you go out and collect all the price data. And finally, you plug everything into a formula to get your index value. Now, don't let the math on this slide intimidate you, because the concept is actually really simple. The index value is basically just the cost of that shopping basket today, divided by what it cost back in the base year, and then you multiply by 100. So if the index is at 150, it just means that prices have gone up by 50% since that base year. See? Simple. All right, let's put on our specialist lens now and zoom in on a really important index for India, the Wholesale Price Index, or WPI. Now, even though India has shifted to using the CPI as its main policy guide, understanding the WPI is still absolutely essential if you want the full picture, especially when it comes to what's happening on the producer and industrial side of the economy. This chart tells you everything you need to know about what the WPI is focused on. Just look at that huge slice of the pie for manufactured products. It's over 64%. That tells you right away that the WPI is all about goods at the factory gate, at the producer level. Primary articles like food and minerals, and then fuel, make up the rest. This makeup is the key to understanding why it behaves the way it does. And here's a quick but super important fact for your exams. The current base year for India's WPI is 2011-12. They update these base years every so often just to make sure the basket of goods they're tracking is still relevant to what the economy actually looks like today. Now, this is a fantastic question, and it's a point that confuses a lot of people. I mean, we all spend a huge amount of our money on services, so why would a major inflation index just completely ignore them? Well, the answer is all about what the WPI was designed to do in the first place. Okay, so here's the key difference. The WPI tracks the price of actual, tangible goods that are sold in bulk at the wholesale level. You know, from one business to another. Think about it. You can sell a ton of steel, but you can't really sell a ton of haircuts, right? Services are intangible, and they're not traded in bulk. The WPI's job is to measure producer inflation for goods. The prices that you and I pay for services are captured by a totally different index, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. They have different jobs. So we'll wrap up with one last thing for you to chew on. Now that you really understand the deep differences between a broad, economy-wide problem like stagflation and a very specific, lopsided issue like skewflation, think about what that means for policymakers. How would a central bank's response have to be completely different for each one? Thinking about questions like that is how you go from just memorizing definitions to truly understanding how economic policy works in the real world.